Welcome to Purple Elephant Radio, where we discuss the mindsets, philosophies, and strategies needed to make art and tell stories that make a dent in this era of abundance. This is a show for the unbound creative, the undefinable artists, and the unidentified philosophers. I'm your host, Sean Green. Welcome back to Purple Elephant Radio. Today's episode, I think, will be quite a philosophical one, and one that I think, at least compared to the past two episodes, will be much more evergreen compared to the more current events-based content that I have been making before. So I want this episode to be as relevant and applicable to someone in a decade from now as it is to someone today. And so the thing I'll be talking about is a worldview or a framework for how people view themselves. So what I'll be basically offering as two ideas is the divided view of self, which I think is how most people live, and then the integrated self, which may be a familiar concept that I've given a different name to, or maybe something you've never even come across before. But really, to start this episode off, I want to open up with an expression from Zen Buddhism that basically says, "Don't paint legs on a snake." Now, you may hear me refer to that quite a bit throughout this episode, but it basically means if it isn't broken, don't fix it, or stop trying to change things with all your good intentions. But at the most fundamental level, it basically means don't add an extra layer of meaning to something which doesn't need meaning. Don't add an extra layer of rationale for what just is. And if that sounds complicated, it will be expanded on throughout this episode, so just bear with me. But really, I bring that up at the start because I think that idea of painting legs on a snake, and by painting legs on a snake, of course, they need socks and shoes, and if you add arms, now they need gloves. So basically overcomplicating something that's very, very simple, or over-explaining something that doesn't even require explanation. I think that relates and basically embodies the divided view of self that I think most people in modern culture live by. And so what is that divided view of self? What does that actually mean? To me, the way I'm defining it is basically someone who lives under this framework, whether they realize it or not, is they have an ideal version of themselves. So they're striving to reach some ideal in the future, or there is some piece of their past that they're trying to get away from, that they're trying to improve upon. So they're either aiming for an ideal in the future or aiming to get out of some, basically whatever the opposite of an ideal is, some negative circumstance from the past. So sort of orienting oneself by future and past versions of themselves. So already it sounds pretty complicated. And I'll give a couple more ideas to really cement this point home. But for now, as it relates to really goal setting and personal development as a whole, all that stuff relates to the divided view of self. And I may contradict myself later on, but at least for now, I want you to think of the stuff that relates to setting goals and all these different disciplines, a lot of them backed by science, some of them not, that you see online, on social media. All that relates to the divided self. And I'll give a personal anecdote to really sort of, I think, expand on this point. As recently as a week ago, I was flipping through an old journal that I had, and around last year at this time, I was basically doing a daily journal for about 6 or 7 months. I don't really remember why I stopped, not relevant to the story. But basically, I was reflecting on my past reflections. And what it made me realize was how divided I was. And what I mean by that is, yes, the ambition was there. The desire to make more money, have more influence, as it relates to Purple Elephant stuff, meditate more, eat healthier, exercise more, all these different disciplines, as well as remove certain vices. Eat less junk food, watch less TV at night. So the list basically was there. And if I were to apply all those things all at once and able to maintain them with ease, then I would reach that hypothetical ideal version of me. But as I went through them, what I saw was not this joyful, playful striving towards those goals, but rather self-doubt and guilt instigated every time that I wasn't able to reach a certain ambition, reach a certain goal. So really what it came down to was, yes, I was very disciplined at that time, but at the same time, I wasn't as disciplined as I looked on paper. I wasn't as disciplined as I made myself sound. Because when in that journal allowed me to compare my actual behaviors day to day to sort of these idealistic goals I wanted to achieve, and they were not compatible. And so when I say the divided self, what I'm really talking about is the way one behaves day to day, just your average self, and this perfect version of you. And if not perfect in the totally unreachable sense, perfect as in 5 years from now I'll be blank. So it's not like it has to be, I've got to be a millionaire and I've got to have a mansion and 4 different homes. Even if it's based on realistic goals, there is still that division of who you are and who you want to be. So I hope I'm explaining this pretty well. But the divided self doesn't just relate to goal setting and self-improvement in that type A personality. It relates to anyone, and the way it really relates to most people is when it comes down to self-love and self-hate. Both of those concepts relate to or fall under the camp of the divided self. Because what it really does, in either case, I love myself, I hate myself. Whether they're set as positive affirmations or just a general feeling of content or discontent. By having that subject-object relationship with your own self, I don't want to overcomplicate this, but that is what you're doing, language-wise. You're saying subject, blank, a verb, object. And the subject and object happen to be I and me, which are really the same person, the same thing. So I hope that doesn't overcomplicate it, but those are connected, self-love and self-hate, by the very fact that they are both divided views of self. I'm not saying that they're equivalent. Of course, when comparing the two side by side, I would say it is much better to love yourself than to hate yourself. I'm not saying that they're equivalent, but I'm saying that there is a third alternative, something that is completely outside the box of subject-object relationship dividing yourself, something outside of that. And the reason I bring that up is because that, I think, is the stuff that is all over social media, especially the self-love side. You see positive psychology, you see all the different affirmations you can do, you hear all the stuff about manifesting abundance, and whether there's the more pragmatic content, which is about hustle culture, making a side income, making money, or whether it's the more lofty spiritual stuff, whether it's manifesting abundance or living more in alignment with life. All that stuff, all the content that I see being made, or most of the content that is advice-based online, I mean, just its very nature is going to create a division in oneself. Because what that content does is say, okay, you are here, that place that is not ideal, and you want to be there. I have some method, I have some strategy, or some piece of advice that will get you closer to that place. So I think everyone who makes that type of content, for the most part, I believe most of them have good intentions. If you remember what I said at the start of this, stop trying to fix the world with your good intentions. Stop painting legs on a snake. So I don't want to denigrate those people. I think making that type of content, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I applaud anyone who has like an Instagram account that's all about quotes of loving yourself and positivity. Great. But at the same time, is it really necessary? And I think that some people will believe it is necessary. And I would love to hear the argument for that. Because I say I'd love to hear it because I think I have a good rebuttal against the divided view of self, even when it is very positive sounding. In two senses, self-discipline sounds really good. Oh, I'm going to get to that ideal version of me. Self-love sounds really good. Oh, I'm going to love myself even more. It's going to boost my self-esteem and self-confidence. These all on the surface seem like really good ideas. And I was in that place, especially on the self-development side. I was in that divided view of self. That's why I, on the surface, seemed very disciplined. But there is an alternative. And an alternative that is not wasting time and energy on basically, in a way, painting legs on a snake. Putting in unneeded extra effort. Whether that is goal setting when you don't feel like goal setting, or meditating when you clearly are not patient enough to meditate. But the reason I think that's so popular, and the reason why self-help is such a blossoming industry, and why so much social media content that's advice-based is on the positive side, I think it all boils down to a lack of trust in our own instincts and our own intuitions. Now, this is something I hinted at in the ChatGPT episode, where I talked about how when it comes to being a digital native, a lot of people will use Google search to solve their problems, even stuff that a scientific study or a listicle would not necessarily be able to answer. So stuff like, I'm feeling stressed in this moment, how do I resolve my stress? Of course, you can find all the generic answers in the world online, but no answer online is going to have your exact specific scenario that is causing your stress. It takes introspection, intuition, insight into your own self to realize, okay, I'm stressed because of this. Am I going to accept it, change it, remove myself from the situation? But stuff that basically relates to only you can provide the answer to yourself. Again, I'm already dividing the view of self in language, but just bear with me here. I think it's become so popular that we basically become culturally ingrained to turn to an external source to solve our introspective dilemmas, our existential crises. And this becomes especially true as it relates to creative endeavors. Because I used to talk about this on the podcast and on the blog I used to do for a long time, but I've always observed how a lot of the content online, say with videography, is making videos about how to make videos. Making basically educational content that doesn't actually do anything for creative expression. And it's become so popular, people are making money off of it, they're gaining followers, they're gaining influence, that everyone's like, okay, I don't need to make fictional stories. I can just talk about how you could hypothetically make a fictional story and the 3-step method to write better films. So basically, I think, have been rewarding this split view of self because advice-based content is so popular on social media. And at the same time, the creative stuff, the stuff that is made for its own sake, is not popular. So there is more incentive to make content that encourages a divided view of self, to make content that encourages striving for an ideal, striving to change yourself. So that's why I think it exists. And I think what I want to do in this last bit of the episode is offer this alternative that it really doesn't take any effort to change to this alternative, but it does require a letting go of your ideals, of your ideal version of you, which I completely understand is pretty difficult. If you've ever done that experiment where it's like press your hands against a doorway for 2 minutes and then after 2 minutes let go, your arms instantly go back up. That's kind of what's occurring here. So many people have been so caught in this, I need an ideal version of me, I need to be constantly improving. They don't realize that it's not necessary. One can still act and do what I'm doing. Say, making a podcast is not an easy thing to do, especially on the edit. I can still do this stuff without any goals or without any future ideal of what will come from this. So what I'm talking about is this alternative to the divided view of self, the integrated self. The way that I feel I am living right now, which basically says there is no ideal that I'm aiming for, there is no thing that I'm trying to run away from. I'm essentially the snake without any need to paint more legs on it. The snake is as it is. I'm not trying to add an extra layer of meaning and justification for why I'm doing what I'm doing. Just to take a very literal example, why am I filming this podcast right now? Because I am. It may not be a satisfying answer, but there is no real justification for it. I mean, of course, I could invent a justification. I could come up with a list of reasons why I feel it's important to do this and why this specific video is so important to listen to. And I'm sure I'll do this in the marketing materials. But ultimately, if you're watching this, you're watching the full episode and not one of those podcast clips, I can tell you the truth. There is no reason why I'm doing this. I'm doing this because I am doing it. Not because I want to, not because I desire to, but because language falls short of even explaining it. It is just what I'm doing. If I really had to put words to it, because I know I'm not doing the best job of explaining it, basically there arises in me an urge to express myself. Sometimes it takes the form of writing. Sometimes it takes the form of talking out loud, podcasting. Sometimes it takes the form of any number of other things. But I know that urge will arise and subside. I can't pull that urge out of myself. I can't force myself to make a podcast when I really, really, really don't want to. And of course, habits do help here. The fact that I've done 3 other video podcasts does make this one a little bit easier. But the fact is, when it came down to the first one, there was no compulsion. There was no ideal that in doing this thing, I was now getting closer to that future version of me. Because I think when it comes to living the integrated self, which again takes no effort, it's literally just a letting go of ideals, letting go of that fallacy that the grass is always greener on the other side. I think the common rebuttal against basically letting go of goals, letting go of ideals, I think the fair response is, well, what if I don't take any action ever again? What if I just become a couch potato because I don't have any goals anymore? And here's what I'd say to that. It relates to what I just said when it comes to why I do this podcast. There is an urge that arises to do things, and there's also an urge that arises to rest. What I'm basically talking about is yin and yang. Yin is the relaxation mode, the passive mode, the not doing anything, the moon, if you want to think about it symbolically. Whereas yang is active, doing stuff, the sun, fire, heat, movement. It flows. The two flow into each other. There is yang of activity, then yin, then yang, then yin. And I think before, again, going back to those journals I mentioned, I had no trust. I did not trust myself to basically move from yin to yang. I thought that if I really did, let myself watch TV at night and sort of give in to these minute little vices, then I would fall short of all my activity, that I would stop writing, that I would stop doing a podcast, that I would stop blogging, that I would stop doing all these things. And what I now realize, the reason I'm so comfortable living in this basically place of no goals, is it always flows from yin to yang, from yang to yin. And I mean, I apologize if this terminology is a little bit foreign to you, but that is how it is. I mean, think about it from rest to activity, rest to activity. I don't need to talk about yin and yang, even though that is literally what it symbolically represents. So I just want you to think about the fact that if you did sort of take your hands off the reins of your supposed instinctual self, I think that you would find that no, you don't resort to your hedonistic, animalistic pleasures. Maybe you would for a time, but I'd like to take a hypothetical of someone who started in this divided view of self and moved to this integrated view of self. And let's say this person is wanting to be more fit, wanting to lose weight. And so in their divided mode of thinking, they have these goals, they have this desired weight they want to reach, they want to remove certain foods from their diet, They want to exercise this amount per week. It's very quantitative. These goals are very well set. If that person were to basically let go of their goals, my guess is they would bounce straight back into going for the junk food, sitting on the couch all day, basically doing the opposite of all their goals they had set. I think that would happen for the first couple days. And they may think, oh my God, this is amazing. This is pleasurable. Why was I forcing myself to do all these painful things? But I think what will arise, if they truly make no judgments and add no level of guilt to being in that hedonistic state, the pain will arise on its own. And I'm not like wishing pain on someone. I'm saying if you eat awful every day, assuming you don't have some super metabolism, if you eat awfully every single day and sit on the couch for 8 hours a day, something will change. It may take a couple weeks, a couple months, but there will be a point. Something may occur where you think, wait, this isn't without any drawbacks. And suddenly, in not making a judgment about the initial pleasure, of not adding that level of guilt of, okay, I'm watching TV, but I know I shouldn't be watching TV. I'm eating junk food, but I know I shouldn't be eating junk food. Because that's the divided view of self. You completely are just fully integrated. Watching TV, you're just watching TV. Eating junk food, you're just enjoying the food. You will realize that the pain is there. The drawbacks are there. That if you are perceptive enough, if you are aware enough, eating junk food all the time does not feel good all the time. And especially if you're wise enough to start to correlate, if you remember the last episode, correlation versus causation, correlate, okay, every time I eat a Big Mac from McDonald's, the next night I feel awful, I sleep awful, X number of bad things happen. Then what happens is the change develops on its own. You're no longer saying, I shouldn't eat the Big Mac because I know it's good to eat healthy foods. And yeah, I'm going to eat this salad even though it sucks. I know it's the right thing to do. You're not forcing yourself onto some ideal projection of who you should be. But that change develops, and when someone says, oh, you're not eating a Big Mac, you're choosing the salad, there's no discipline involved in it. Because you realize the pain that's involved in the simple vice-based pleasures. So again, I made this a hypothetical example, and I've made it exclusive to unhealthy eating. But it, of course, can apply to any number of things. But again, for this person, if they are aware enough and they are not eating to ignore emotions, and basically I'm imagining someone who has been on a diet, who instead of going through the cycle of dieting, binging, etc., if in their binging portion of the cycle, if they're ultra aware in that moment, in every moment that they're binging, and they're not ignoring their emotions, they're not adding a level of guilt of this is bad, but I'll eat my feelings away, the drawbacks become obvious. And when the drawbacks become obvious, change becomes easy. Change becomes obvious. Change does not require some external future goal to get to that point. So again, in this example, maybe that person who has suddenly went to this integrated view of self, maybe they won't reach their original goal that they set way back when. That maybe they won't reach their ideal weight. But at the same time, I would say, I don't think that they would be in that ultra low binging place that they imagine they would fall into. They would be somewhere in between. They would be somewhere in the middle ground of ultimate binging and ultimate discipline. And so what I would say with that example of being in the middle ground, someone may make the argument that, okay, that's great, but what you just laid out, they didn't reach their original goals. And I would come back and say, well, what made you think those goals were the correct goals for you? Because of course you can list justifications and rationale for as much as you have time. But the point is, all those goals, all those ideals always boil down to painting legs on a snake. The snake which never needed legs to move, which was slithering just fine before you thought it would be a good idea to add some feet. But just as a little tangent, as it relates to free will and predeterminism, someone may think, okay, is the divided self a predetermined life because you're aiming at this one thing, or do you have free will because you're choosing that end goal? Or on the other side, the integrated self, is it free will because you're not aiming for any number of goals? Or is it predetermined because you're basically just going based on your own instincts? And how are those being controlled? It's all, you never controlled that. You're just feeling the urges and you're just going with the urges. So what I'm saying is you can make the case for free will and predeterminism either way. But really when it comes down to it, whether one could even get a confirmation on whether they have free will or predeterminism as it relates to the divided self or the integrated self, I would come back and say it doesn't matter if you know or don't know, or if you think one way or the other. Those are just abstract concepts. And yes, philosophers may enjoy debating between the two for the rest of eternity, but it does not affect your day-to-day life. This idea of the divided self and the integrated self, though, does. Because to maintain the divided view of self, where you are adding guilt to yourself whenever you feel like you're not reaching some ideal version of you, or when you're especially praising stuff that it seems like it's the right thing to do, but you have no idea if it's actually what you should be doing. And that's really what it relates to with midlife crises, where someone may think, oh, I just wanted to be super rich my whole life, and now that I'm 50 and have all the money in the world, I'm still unhappy. What the hell? Well, in that divided view of self, they got to their ideal. But because they were unable to live in this integrated view of self, because they were unable to basically accept where they are at the moment they're there, they couldn't be satisfied once they had everything they originally wanted. So even if you were standing on the greenest grass on all of earth, when you maintain the divided view of self, there's always going to be a feeling of discontent, a feeling like this isn't enough, like you're still seeking for something more. And it's the integrated self which can accept the moment as it is, which can enjoy doing the work as I'm recording this podcast, and also enjoy the fruits of the work, seeing how people respond to the episode without having to set a goal to hit a certain metric. So I know I've gotten a little bit off track, but just to finally end this thing, I just wanted to say, so at the end of last episode, I talked about living an optionality-based life and living a narrative-based life. And just really, really briefly, optionality-based life means giving yourself many options because you don't know what the future will be. The narrative-based life says, I know what the future holds for me, so I'm going to prepare for it. I'm sure if you did see the end of that episode, I'm sure it's pretty obvious how those relate to what I talked about today. The divided self, the view that there is an ideal version of you that you can reach in the future, of course relates to the narrative-based life. And of course, the optionality-based life relates to the integrated view of self, where you don't know what the future will hold. And there's no need to predict or have an ideal version of oneself that you are trying to aim towards. I mean, you could hypothetically still have goals, but I think this is the really important thing. I'm not saying, again, I have not said don't set goals, that all this personal development stuff doesn't matter. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying do that stuff when the urge arises. Don't try everything that you read or see online. Do the things that you feel like doing. And it's a very subtle distinction, but it makes a monumental difference in one's satisfaction with the way they're living their life. Because in that divided view of self, you're always seeking. You're always seeking the next thing, the next tool, the next trick, the next piece of advice that's going to make you better than who you are now. But the integrated self still allows for those things, still allows you to try different techniques. Yes, I still meditate most mornings. Yes, I still write most mornings, even though I don't have a writing habit. But it's really important when it comes to the integrated view of self. This is not just a giving up on everything, giving up on life. What I'm saying is being very present in the moment of, as I'm recording this podcast, I'm thinking about recording this podcast. Really, I'm not thinking at all. I'm just recording it. But what I'm saying is you need to be aware, because especially when it comes to your vices, your negative habits, without awareness, yes, you may fall into that addiction trap, and you may fall into just pure hedonistic pleasures. The stuff that Freud warned about if the id was ever, allowed to rise above, and everyone would be back to their base animalistic instincts. I think that only occurs when awareness is not there. Because awareness allows you to see that, okay, watching TV every night, even though it's pleasurable in the moment, it does have drawbacks. And it's not like I need to compulsively force myself to stop watching TV. But once I become aware of the drawbacks, whether it relates to too much TV watching, overeating, any number of vices, once you're aware of those drawbacks, boom, change becomes easy. It's not a discipline. It doesn't require willpower. So I would like to end this episode with a metaphor that sort of really, I think, illustrates the important difference between the integrated self and the divided self. The integrated self could be likened to a very wise gardener. They understand that the way to get a flower to grow, the way to get a plant to grow, is to create the environment for growth, to nurture the soil, to make sure it gets lots of sun, and somehow, some way, growth, transformation happens. But it was not on the part of the gardener. The gardener just maintained the environment, and the growth happened on its own. And then in the divided view of self, the one who is using willpower and discipline to reach some ideal version of themselves, I would liken that to a gardener trying to crack open a seed in search of a flower. Let growth happen on its own. There is no need to strive for anything. So as long as you're aware in the moment, the integrated self is the easier way to live. And what I mean, again, by being aware in the moment, I mean anything that is pleasurable, you understand that it has some painful counterpart, that same action. So whether you take the pain in the first half, as in doing a very difficult exercise, the pleasure comes after, or whether you do something that's pleasurable in the moment but painful much longer after, as when having a night of drinking. It's that next day that the pain really shows up. You have to be able to connect the dots, to see the trade-offs involved in every single action. And then this ideal you, this personally developed self, evolves on its own. You don't have to try, you don't have to use willpower for it. You become the ideal version of you when you stop trying to be the ideal version of you. And I'll let that little paradox end this episode off.
If you like this episode, it would mean a hell of a lot if you rated it on Spotify, on iTunes, left a nice review. Thank you.